Just so everyone knows, this meeting is being recorded and we will be accepting questions through the chat at the bottom of the screen. This video recording will be available on our YouTube channel as well if you miss anything, so don't worry about taking notes. And we will be posting all of the important links into the chat. All right, Howard, we ready to get going?
Yes, thanks, Callan. Welcome, everyone. I'm Howard Wial, Senior Vice President and Director of Research at ICIC. And I would like to start this webinar today about our experience at ICIC in tracking the impact of the coronavirus recession and recovery on businesses and jobs in the 100 largest metropolitan areas throughout the nation. So we have been, since last November, presenting the most detailed and comprehensive information about what has happened to businesses and jobs in each of the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas during the coronavirus recession and recovery. We've been doing that tracking for the period starting in the second quarter of 2020, which is when the first impacts of the coronavirus recession start showing up in our data, and running through the first quarter of this year. And we produced 4 quarterly reports. And these reports are distinctive because they show what has happened to businesses and jobs by a number of things that nobody else looks at. The size of the business being one of the biggest ones. Have small businesses really been hurt more than bigger ones? Sneak preview, the answer is yes. Under-resourced communities and non-under-resourced communities. We define under-resourced communities as relatively heavily populated areas of high poverty and low income located in metropolitan areas. Are the under-resourced communities, or rather are businesses in the under-resourced communities and the jobs at those businesses doing worse than those in other parts of the metropolitan area? I won't give you a sneak preview on that one. Just stay tuned. We also look at industry, which many other people do too. And we look at race and ethnicity of business owners, which other people do not look at. How are Black-owned businesses and Latino-owned businesses and Asian-owned businesses and white-owned businesses doing relative to each other? So we started this series in the hopes that the information we provide would be useful to policymakers and small business assistance providers and community and economic development professionals, foundations, and researchers, and anyone who wants to know how businesses and jobs have been doing in their metropolitan areas over the course of the pandemic, and how they can best target assistance to the businesses and locations that need it most. And we certainly have heard from people who are using it for exactly that purpose. We didn't originally expect, but are very glad that impact investors have also been using our materials, and they have found them useful as an overview to get some idea about what the investment climate has been or might be likely to be like, particularly if they're interested in investing in businesses owned by people of color or small businesses or businesses located in under-resourced communities. So every quarter we've been producing an overall summary report, and we've also been producing a data dashboard. So I'm going to talk first about what the general findings have been from the series of reports that we've been doing. I'll give you 7 big takeaways from our work. After I do that, there'll be some time to ask questions, and then I'll turn the meeting over to my colleague Miles Chandler, who will show you the data dashboard. The data dashboard gives detailed information about specific types of businesses in specific locations in specific metropolitan areas, so you can really drill down and get the details in a way that you can't from the overall. and you can ask questions about the data dashboard after Miles is done. And then we will have a presentation by James Owen, a policy analyst in the mayor's office for the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, to give a practitioner and policy perspective on how he has found our work useful in his work for the city. And there'll be time for questions on that after his presentation. And then if you didn't get to ask all your questions, there will be more time for questions at the end, and we'll be happy to answer them. Let me share the screen. Let me first show you where you can find our research at this URL, https://icic.org/latest-research. And here you can contact me. There's my phone number and email if you need any additional information if something comes up after the webinar is over. I should also say that this research was funded quite generously by the Ewan Marion Kaufman Foundation, and we are extremely grateful for their support of our work. Nevertheless, any information and opinions expressed in this webinar are solely the responsibility of ICIC and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Kaufman Foundation. Let me go to our first results. So as I said, we have 7 big takeaways from our work. The first big takeaway is that the business recovery has lagged the jobs recovery. You can see that as of the first quarter of this year, which is the most recent quarter for which we have information, there were only 82% of the businesses that there were at the beginning of the pandemic in the second quarter of 2020, but 92% of the jobs. And that's probably because, as we'll see a little bit later, most of the businesses are very small, are small businesses, actually very small businesses, and very small businesses have had the hardest time recovering from the pandemic, whereas the jobs are tilted more toward the medium and large size businesses, and medium and large size businesses have recovered better from the pandemic. So that's probably what's going on. So first takeaway, jobs recovery has been better than business recovery. Second big takeaway, which you can also see here, is that the recovery has been, I would say, somewhat anemic. Through the middle of last year, there was basically a jobs decline since the beginning of the pandemic. And then you started to see a little bit of a recovery with some fits and starts, but a little bit of recovery in jobs after that point. And that's continued through the first quarter of this year. When it comes to businesses, businesses bottomed out in the first quarter of last year before there were any vaccines, remember? And then we started to see a recovery. But then at the end of this year, at the end of last year, rather, and beginning of this year, that all reversed itself. The number of businesses fell off a cliff, and all that progress that was made on business recovery was reversed. So that's the second big takeaway. Not a sharp, sustained recovery, a bit of a recovery on jobs, and at first a bit of recovery on businesses, but then a big drop off on jobs, so that we are at our lowest point, or rather on businesses, so that we're at our lowest point on businesses that we've been at since the pandemic started. Takeaway number 3. Smaller businesses have been hurt really hard, whereas bigger ones have done much better. If you look at businesses with 20 or more employees. Those with 20 to 49 are here, and those with 50 to 99 are here. And then up at the very top, you could see businesses with 100 or more employees. They've done pretty well. They've recovered more than 90% or more than 95% of the jobs they had at the start of the pandemic. And those with 100 or more employees are up to 99% of the jobs that they had at the start of the pandemic. The ones in the moderately small category, those with 5 to 9 or 10 to 19 employees, well, they suffered at the beginning of the pandemic, had a little bit of recovery, and then basically stayed flat. So no more bleeding of jobs from those businesses, but not much of an upturn either. But the businesses, the very smallest businesses, those with only 1 to 4 employees, well, they were hit the hardest to begin with in the pandemic. They had a bit of a recovery, but then since the end of last year, their jobs just fell off a cliff in the last quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year. So if any businesses need the most targeted assistance, it's the ones with 1 to 4 employees, the very smallest businesses. And as I said earlier, it's because most of the businesses are in these very small size categories. This big drop off is probably the main reason why the number of businesses lag the number of jobs in the recovery that has occurred so far. So that's takeaway number 3. Big problems still persist for smaller businesses. Our fourth takeaway is that Black-owned businesses have done relatively well compared to other groups. For the last several quarters, because of the way our data are presented, we've only been able to show what has happened in the last quarter. And as you can see, in the first quarter of this year, Black-owned businesses have increased their employment by almost 6%, whereas other groups have increased by 2% or less. Now, we have to be a little bit cautious in putting this information together with previous information to talk about what has happened over the course of the entire pandemic, because the nature of the data changed a bit. But if we do put that information together, what we think we see is that Black-owned businesses have probably recovered the best. If they have not completely recovered, they probably come pretty close to completely recovering all the jobs that they lost during the recession. And that's primarily because even though they were hit the hardest at the outset of the pandemic, they had some big spurts of growth last summer and again in the first quarter of this year. Hispanic or Latino-owned businesses were also hit very hard at the beginning of the pandemic, but they didn't recover quite as much. There are probably over 90%. They're probably at over 90% of the jobs that they had at the beginning of the pandemic, but they're not quite up there with Black-owned businesses. White-owned businesses were hurt the least at the beginning of the pandemic, but they also didn't have the huge upturn that Black-owned businesses had, and overall they're probably lagging a bit behind Black-owned businesses in terms of percentage of jobs that have been recovered since the beginning of the pandemic. And Asian-owned businesses have shown a pattern somewhat similar to white-owned businesses, maybe a little bit less recovery overall. As I said, that all has to be taken with some caution because of the change in the nature of the data, but that's our best guess as to what happened over the course of the entire pandemic to jobs at businesses owned by members of these 4 large racial and ethnic groups. So that's our next takeaway. Industries. Here you can see that accommodation and food services and entertainment have been lagging the most. they haven't even recovered to 90% of the jobs that they had at the beginning of the pandemic. Whereas healthcare has done the best overall despite a recent downturn. They're at about 95% of the jobs that they had at the beginning of the pandemic. And other industries are somewhere in between. And you can see much more detail about industries on the dashboard in the report. And for the purpose of this overview, I'm just showing you the biggest industries that show the most notable patterns of change over the course of the pandemic. So that's takeaway number 5. Industries have shown very different patterns, and the very, very low, very, very slow recovery of accommodation and food services from the huge drop at the beginning of the pandemic is probably not very surprising, but as we'll see, it'll show up a little bit later when we look at some specific metropolitan areas that are very heavily dependent on accommodation and food services. Takeaway number 6, somewhat surprisingly, if we compare under-resourced communities to the rest of the metropolitan areas, what we call URC are under-resourced communities, they're that blue line here, and OMA, other parts of the metropolitan area, are the red line here, we don't see a whole lot of difference. If anything, under-resourced communities have done slightly better over the course of the entire pandemic. So this shows you that geography and the geography of income are not the same as race and ethnicity of business owners. So even though the majority of residents of under-resourced communities are either Black or Latino or Hispanic, you don't see impacts by race or ethnicity showing up in the comparison of under-resourced communities to other parts of the metropolitan area, either at the beginning of the pandemic or anywhere in between or in the most recent quarter. So don't confuse race and ethnicity with the geography of income. They are related, but for the kind of tracking that we're doing, they are not the same thing, and they produce pretty different results. Our final big takeaway, which I don't have a slide for, so let me stop sharing screen, is that no metropolitan area has fully recovered from the recession. The best recovery that we've seen is in the Baton Rouge, Louisiana metropolitan area, which in the first quarter of this year is up to 98% of the jobs that it had at the beginning of the pandemic. The worst is in Miami, which is at only, or was at only 86% of the jobs that it had at the beginning of the pandemic. In general, metropolitan areas in Utah did relatively well. Metropolitan areas in the Northeast did relatively well. Metropolitan areas in Florida and California did not do well at all. None of the big metropolitan areas in those states, particularly in California, had a very strong recovery. And that may be due to the strong dependence of many of those metropolitan areas on tourism. And as we saw, accommodation and food service has had, among major industries, the hardest time recovering. So that may be what's behind the regional pattern. No particular pattern by size of metro. So that's what's going on by geography in terms of metropolitan areas. So that's what we've learned in those 7 big takeaways from our last 4 quarters of tracking the impact of the recession and recovery on businesses and jobs in the 100 largest metropolitan areas. Open the floor to questions, which you should feel free to put in the chat. Well, seeing no questions right now, I will turn the floor over to my colleague Miles Chandler, who will show you how to use our data dashboard, which gives you all the interesting results about specific locations and specific types of businesses. And then, if there are any questions about either what I've said or what Miles has said, there'll be plenty of time later on to ask more questions, so you don't have to worry if you don't have questions right now. You can ask them later. Miles, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. So like Howard said, in addition to a quarterly report, we've been updating a data dashboard online throughout this entire project. The dashboard serves as a really nice foil to these quarterly reports because the reports are giving pretty in-depth information about very specific or high-level results for every quarter. Meanwhile, the dashboard is very customizable and has pretty granular information that's updated weekly about each of the nation's top 100 metro areas. So let me share my screen here. I will pull up an example of that dashboard. Is that visible? Yeah, great. Okay, so I have pulled up, hopefully to gel well with James's presentation in a few minutes here. I've pulled up the tracker for Little Rock, the metro area. So that includes Little Rock, North Little Rock, and Conway, Arkansas, all together as metro area. So generally, we see the same thing that Howard had mentioned in the report playing out on the dashboard for Little Rock. Jobs have recovered much more so than businesses over the course of the pandemic. You can see that there was that initial plunge during the first several quarters that we were monitoring, and then a slight recovery in the middle, and then businesses have continued to decline. Within Little Rock, we can compare the under-resourced communities and the other parts of the metro area. Interestingly enough, this is something I'll talk about throughout my little presentation here, but you can see that there's actually a pretty marked difference in employment over the last quarter between the under-resourced communities and the other parts of the metro area in Little Rock, even as businesses have stayed more or less in lockstep in the two parts of the city. So the tracker also gives an expanded number of industries that you can look at beyond what were published in our quarterly report, but also includes those. So we can see that healthcare is, predictably up during the whole pandemic, both in terms of discrete number of businesses as well as percent change from the second quarter of 2020, which we're calling the beginning of the pandemic. You can see a similar trend in jobs. Oh, actually, so we have a similar number of, or I guess the trends in discrete numbers of businesses and jobs are more or less similar, but the percent changes are relatively different. So we can see since the beginning of the pandemic, actually educational services is the industry with the largest gain of 31% in Little Rock, followed by public services at 15%, and utilities at 12%. I think it's really instructive to have both the numbers and the percent changes distributed or displayed together, because that gives you a sense of not only the percent change, but the relative gravity of that percent change. Because, for example, a 12% change in an industry with only 2.3 thousand jobs is relatively less meaningful or impactful than a change 0.5 in an industry with 83,000 jobs. So I like having those two statistics parallel to be able to compare. So echoing what Howard had also said, in Little Rock, businesses and jobs have definitely suffered among those smallest establishments. So businesses with 1 to 4 employees I've had very little recovery in terms of number of businesses, and also they've actually worsened in both categories. The only category that has improved is those with 100 or more employees. And then we can see just the change from the last quarter, changed by race and ethnicity of business owner. So among businesses, there's really nothing super significant. Hispanic or Latino-owned businesses and white-owned businesses had very modest advances of around 0.2 or 0.8%. It's like Jewish and Middle Eastern-owned businesses, almost a percentage point gain in Native American and Black and Asian and Pacific Islander-owned businesses, also losses, albeit relatively small ones. However, changes in jobs were are a much more interesting and drastic change. So you can see here that over the past quarter, employment at businesses owned by white people jumped almost 8%, which is the most drastic change that we've seen, at least in Little Rock, over the past entire period we've been monitoring. Another nice feature about the data dashboard is you can pull out the subgeographies of any of the 100 largest metro areas. So I've only pulled up Little Rock here, but they're all in here. If you want to pull them up in adjacent tabs to compare between metros, or even compare between the profile of the under-resourced communities versus the total metro, or just the balance of the metro area, the other parts. All of that's really easy to do. You just pull up a new tab, and that makes those sorts of comparisons really, really easy. But if we look back to the trend I was describing, yeah, just within the under-resourced communities, we see a pretty strong jump in employment among white-owned businesses, the largest business categories, and then similar trends, both in terms of businesses and jobs by industry. So there's a ton of complexity that you can pull out of this dashboard, and comparisons you can make between all of these different kind of crossings of the data that I'm not going to go into here. I'll allow you to do that on your own time. But those were some kind of important things to pull out about over this past over this past week, technically, for most of these charts, but in the last quarter. So.
Okay, thanks, Miles. And once again, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you don't have them now, we can catch them after James' presentation. Let me do two more things before I turn the floor over to James. First of all, let me acknowledge our partners at the Business Dynamics Research Consortium of the University of Wisconsin, who are the people who put the tech side of the dashboard together and made it appear in such a user-friendly fashion. And then let me also put our URL where you can find both our reports and our dashboard into the chat. So I'm doing that right now. And now it's my pleasure to introduce James Owen with the City of Little Rock, who will give a policy and practitioner perspective on how he has been using our reports and dashboard. James?
Sure. Thank you so much, and good to be with all of you guys. Thanks for the invitation to talk about some of the things that we've been doing here in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so I'm going to share my screen, and y'all let me know if you cannot see that. We should be good. So again, in my role, I serve as the policy analyst in the office of the mayor here in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so generally my policy portfolio is economic development, health, and education policy. And so the nexus between all of that and COVID's impact, really, it all meshes together. And so this resource, when I first ran across it, and it was first shared with me, was just a great way to kind of find a shortcut to see if some of the policy interventions that we were doing around COVID maybe we're making an impact. And so that's what I'm going to talk about briefly here today. So wanted to give a little context of what our policy response was here in Little Rock. And so Mayor Frank Scott Jr. Was the first popularly elected Black mayor in the history of Little Rock. And so he was elected in 2019. And one of the things that he's really brought to the city and emphasized in all of our policy making is that our lens for this work is what he calls equitable economics. And so it's applying that equity lens to every single thing that we do. The other fun thing is that Mayor Scott has kind of branded himself as the Chief Growth Officer of the city of Little Rock. And so he serves as the mayor and he fulfills his duties there, but he also really leans into that role of, being a cheerleader for business and all business in Little Rock, not just those established businesses. So, we do both sides of that equity work in economics of the small business and the capital E, capital D economic development. And so kind of mirroring that, our COVID response and some of the things that we did as a city was, in the short term, we offered kind of targeted COVID relief grants. And so this was something that you saw a lot of other municipalities and different levels of government do. But we had about 250 applications in the first little bit that it was open. We had to work with a lot of people to make sure that they were able to meet the tax returns and things like that, and that they were registered to do business with the city. But we had a pretty large demand for those targeted COVID relief grants. So that was the immediate thing that we did. The longer term focus that we've had is kind of based off some of those COVID relief grants where people didn't have tax returns or weren't registered to do business at the city. We wanted to create a minority focused small business incubator called Build Academy. And so we will graduate our second class of that actually on Thursday. So trying to make sure that we're providing the resources and the knowledge and the know-how to start your business at a very basic level. And make sure that we're doing that throughout the city, no matter what you look like or where you're from. Some of the other things that we've done is targeted community development, which is a initiative passed by our board to specifically allocate $5 million to some zones in the city that they've kind of identified as under-resourced. And so I don't know if that 100% meshes with ICIC's definition of that, but probably fairly similar. And the mayor has also, pushed a 25% procurement goal where 25% of all the things that the city buys will come from women and minority-owned businesses. So those are kind of some of the policy initiatives that we were working on to kind of make sure that we recover and grow in that mold of the mayor being the chief growth officer, but also that this recovery hopefully has that equity lens built into it and has that equity as part of it, as a cornerstone to it. And so where this report or these series of reports from that Howard and his colleagues have put together, where that's really helpful for us is identifying impact. So it's not causal because we probably can't say one-to-one, that's probably not fair. But we think that there probably is some signal within the noise with these reports to see, hey, if we're setting out this policy that has a clear equity bent to it, is it kind of working? And so this is from the first of the series of reports, which was Q2 2020 to Q2 2021, these were kind of the Little Rock MSA's rankings. And so we were number 50 overall. We were right in the middle of the pack, which the saying that we often use about economic development in Arkansas is that we are a no boom and no bust economy. We're very diverse in our in where we employ people, but that means we don't have the worst of the bad times, but we also don't have the best of the good times. And so it was very interesting to see that kind of reflected in number 50 overall. But as it relates to Little Rock, right? Where did we rank, and were some of the policy interventions that we did in 2020, did they have some sort of impact? And so using that number 50 as a barometer, right? We were 29th within that first report for employment improvement in under-resourced communities. Now, those under-resourced communities not exclusive to Little Rock, but probably more probably skew toward Little Rock. We were number 47 for employment improvement in small businesses, so kind of close to our overall there. We were number 24 for employment improvement in Black-owned businesses, and that's the one that really caught my eye, because those were the businesses that I think we were trying to reach with that small business grant, those COVID grant, the COVID relief grant. And so that was interesting, and that's what kind of made me want to dig further into the report. Interestingly, though, we were number 58 for Hispanic and Latino-owned business employment improvement. And so this is a screenshot. I didn't have room to show the whole thing, but just showing kind of that Black-owned business table, and that we were number 24. So if we're doing if we're within that first quartile, that's probably a pretty good indicator that we're doing something right. And so that's always nice to see. So kind of the takeaways and how I've been using this as a practitioner, and kind of what I share with my colleagues who also want to look at this data and want to work on the equity work, is that this can be used both ways, right? So measuring impact from policy decisions that we've made and policies that we've implemented, seeing if it tracks. So right, if the policy goal is to make sure that Black-owned business comes back strong after COVID, then there's some signal that maybe that one worked, at least for that first report, that first time frame. But also look at it for planning future programs. And so the fact that we did not do that we actually were number 58 for Hispanic and Latino-owned business, that kind of signaled to us that we can do better there. And so that, coupled with a lot of anecdotal evidence and a lot of great work that our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has been doing here in Little Rock, we've since launched Emprende, which means to start in Spanish. And it's a series of 3 modules that are 4-week trainings in Spanish to help Hispanic and Latino-owned businesses. And so again, that's a way that seeing this data and being like, okay, we're not doing so good with this group, or we're not doing so good with very small businesses of 1 to 4, or within this specific industry, using that to inform future program planning. I think that's a very powerful use of this data, and that's where, frankly, I want to use this most recent report to go back and sit down with some of our data inclined folks at the city to see how can we use this to better plan our practices and programs and policies going forward. For the small businesses, right? And I think this is actually something that's shown in the most recent report. I believe Little Rock was number 1 in this most recent quarter for employment improvement. And so that's where some of that kind of big capital E, capital D economic development shows up, showing that, the mayor being chief growth officer and the jobs that have been recruited here coupled with the small business is actually causing that job growth. And so that's another place where I think this data is useful to see if some of those longer term things, as you track it over time, to see if that actually bears out. So maybe that strategy is working. And then again, with the Black-owned business in that first report, some signal that the targeted relief that we had, some signal that it's showing up. So again, it's not perfect, but it's a very easy, very user-friendly dashboard that just in a few minutes, you can see how you're doing in broad strokes, and that's very valuable. As a local government, we're resource constrained, we're time constrained. So anything that makes that easier is always nice. So that's one of the reasons why I've really been into this tool and shared it with some of my colleagues. So again, I kind of already touched on this, but closing thoughts, give some feedback on policy actions and measuring impact. And it's that high level look to see if policies and programs are being felt. And it's easy to digest. We're all capacity constrained. So it's very helpful. If you're with a nonprofit, an economic development agency, a chamber of commerce, or a city, I would recommend to y'all to share this resource, because I think it's great, even if you're looking back and seeing, okay, was this policy effective? Do we have any impact data? So that's all I have, and I'll stop my share. I know I saw, I guess, was there anything in the chat? No, okay. Well, happy to answer any questions, and wanted to thank ICIC again for asking me to come on here and share how I've used this, and thank them for getting a good resource out there.
Right, and thanks to you, James, for coming and sharing what you've done with our materials, with our audience here. So if anyone has any further questions, we are happy to answer them now. So what other ways would you recommend that institutions can use this tool? So government organizations that fund small business support, and especially small business recovery efforts, can draw pretty directly from the kinds of things that James talked about. As I said, we've heard from some impact investors that have used this to, in very broad sense, get an idea of where they might want to invest by seeing what the patterns of business and job growth have been in different places and for different kinds of businesses. We have heard from some very targeted economic development organizations that deal with some very specific, small, well-defined areas that are just interested in comparing what they see on the ground in their little area with what's going on in the rest of their metropolitan area and with the different kinds of businesses in their metropolitan area. Community foundations can use this for planning purposes. They are helping to pick up the slack that in some cases has been left by particularly the reduction in federal government assistance from what was available earlier in the pandemic. They can see, well, where are the needs? So those are some possible ways that people could use our work. Andre asks, can we quickly explain again why we shouldn't conflate race and location? Even though most of the people who live in under-resourced communities are either Black or Hispanic or Latino, and that differs somewhat in different parts of the country and in different metropolitan areas, you don't necessarily see the results for Hispanic or Latino or Black business owners showing up in under-resourced communities. And Part of that is that the disproportionate representation doesn't necessarily mean a majority, particularly in individual metropolitan areas. So the fact that there are, there may be, I would say, 40% of the residents of a particular under-resourced community are Black or Latino, that doesn't necessarily constitute a majority. A majority of the residents of that under-resourced community might still be white. So disproportionate representation is not necessarily a majority. And the second reason why you shouldn't take geography and race or ethnicity to be good proxies for one another is that we looked at the race and ethnicity of business owners, not the race and ethnicity of residents, because race and ethnicity of business owners is what's relevant to employment at those businesses. And even in places where a majority of the residents are Black or Hispanic or Latino, that doesn't necessarily mean a majority of the business owners who own businesses in those areas are Black or Hispanic or Latino. So I think those are two big reasons why you should not take one to be a substitute for the other. They are related. It's worth looking at them together, but you can't just assume that they're going to show you the same thing. Other questions? Well, once again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. And once again, let me show you where you can find our research at this URL that I'm showing you right here. If you have any questions that come up after the webinar, feel free to contact me either by phone or by email, and I will be happy to answer you. This webinar represents our findings from a year of tracking the impact of the coronavirus recession and recovery on businesses and jobs in the 100 largest metropolitan areas. It is the last in our current series. Doesn't necessarily mean we might not do another one at some point in the future. But right now, the information that we have is current through the first quarter of this year, and it will continue to be up on our website for the rest of the year. The dashboard will be updated. It will not be updated beyond the first quarter of this year, but there will be corrections to some of the information for the periods that we're already showing. So if you go to the dashboard and you see that something is different next week than it is this week, or if you see that something's different in the report than it is in the dashboard, that doesn't mean that there's a mistake. It just means that the dashboard has been updated. Last call for any further questions. Well, we're very grateful to everyone who has participated in the webinar, and we're very glad to have had this opportunity, and grateful particularly to Callan Small of ICIC for facilitating the tech side of the webinar, and to Andre Legister of ICIC on the communication side. And thanks again to everyone participating.